Well, Assalamu alaikum,
Welcome.
Mr. Sardar. Welcome to the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK, here in Cardiff.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
You're here today to talk about Islam, public space and British Muslims. Could you briefly sum up what you're going to be talking about?
I'll try. In Britain, when normally religion plays no part in public space, we don't really like issues of religion, or in fact even the mention of God in public space. But on the other hand, as Islam demands public engagement, because Islam is all about social justice, it's all about changing the world to a certain extent. So I think Muslims cannot stay away from public space. It is important for Muslims to engage in public space. I think my first point is that we need to engage. As Muslims, we need to engage with public space. We need to raise, not just our issue, but actually issues of ethics and morality in public space from our own perspective. But at the same time, we are British. And that means there is a certain amount of British history that we need to appreciate, a history of religion in Britain. And we don't do certain things in public spaces. And there are certain principles of public space that we need to also adopt. For example, the principle of you have total freedom of expression. So it's no point saying Islam says, you can't express yourself. I mean, in the kind of public space that we find in Britain, freedom of expression is a hard-won freedom that has a long history, and it has a history against religious struggle as well, in that sense. So to some extent, we need to adopt certain British values, which, in fact, if you actually look at them, they're also part and parcel of Islamic values. They're not all they're not antitheses that most people think that. Or rather, some Muslims think that certain British values are antitheses. But I would argue that, in fact, the values of fairness, the values of freedom of expression, human rights, and so on and so forth are essentially are also values of Islam in that sense. So I'm arguing for British Muslims to engage with public space, to open a public space to religious dialogue, but do it with an appreciation of British history and by also embracing certain values that we find in Britain that I see as universal values.
You recently released Sporty Britain.
Mm-hmm.
What was the target audience that you have in mind?
Oh, anybody who likes a good read. I mean, Baltic Britain's is basically it's about British Asian identity, and it's about British Asians. But it's done in a way that it should appeal to a lot of people who are not British. So I would hope that a lot of people in Australia, for example, read that, and because it also tells a cracking good story. And it's also about colonialism. So anybody in, say, India or Pakistan or Africa would read it, because it describes certain colonial experiences, which I also think are universal colonial experiences. So there's no, I didn't have a particular individual in mind saying, this book is written for that particular individual. Anybody who likes a good read, basically, or who wants to know something about Asians, or who they want to know about contemporary multicultural Britain, or they want to know something about colonial history, or they're interested in me and my story, because it also says my story in a very, hopefully, kind of humorous way.
In your writing on Islam, you often talk through the lens of your personal experiences. What inspires you to write in that way?
Well, I think that's the quickest way to engage people. If you really want to get somebody's attention, the individual story has much more attraction than if you just talk about in abstract terms or large in sort of group terms. If you look at television, the stories that capture you on television are always the individual VPs. This little girl has suffered, or you may have a particular individual who takes you through a story in a documentary. So I think in being having a kind of a television background, I'm aware that individual stories have real power. So I'll try to tell my own story in some way. I think that weaving of personal story makes my writing hopefully much more interesting and more engaging. So my ideas are not just abstract ideas, but they're ideas that actually come down to the ground level. If they touch me, so hopefully they'll touch you as well.